Hi, my name is Peter Andras. I'm a professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 2, the definitions of systems, and this is part 2 of lecture 2. Following the previous part of these lectures where we introduced the concept of communications and we defined systems as the systems of communications, where the communication units are outside of the systems, and these are seen as purely abstract communication units which can generate the communications without considering their internal structures. We continue here by considering further fundamental concepts. The action and perception of the system, the concept of the reference, and the main function of the systems, these communication systems that we consider. So let's look at the interaction between the system and the environment. As we said, the system is a set of communications between communication units. However, the communication units are not part of the system itself. It's only their communications which composes the system. So in this way, the communication units are independent of the system in a sense, and they may also participate in other communications. And these other communications are not necessarily part of the system. So just to give you an example, a human may work in a company and they may contribute communications to the company, but when they go home they also communicate with their family. So the two sets of communications, or they may overlap. In principle, these are different sets of communications, and the family communications are not part of the company communications. Now, the behavior of a communication unit may be influenced by their participation in the outside of the system communications. So, given that the communication unit generates communications both for the systems and for the environment as well, from the system's perspective, and their communication generating behavior is determined somehow by what's inside of them, what we ignore, considering it as a black box. But what happens is that these other communications still influence the communications that it may generate within the system. So consider a simple technical example. If you have a cordless phone, it may generate interference with some electronic equipment, so you hear noise in it. It is a communication between your cordless phone and, let's say, your TV, but that's not part of the communication systems that we want to use the phone for. But this interferes with it and influences the communication behavior of the communication unit within the system as well. Now, this effect that the communication units participate in other communications, and that has an impact on the communications generated within the system as well. These are the impacts of the environment of the system onto the system. So, to consider another example, take for example antibiotics and bacteria. Now, antibiotics effectively work. These are molecules which interact with other molecules, and they block the proper interactions between molecules within the bacterium. As a result, the bacterium ultimately dies. So there is an interference with the communications caused by the environment, which alters the communications within the bacterial cell, these molecular interactions, and ultimately that causes the destruction of the cell. So, in the same way, the systems also have impact on their environment. These are the system actions. So, the same way, communications within the system happen, and they influence the behavior of their communication units which generate these communications. So the participation of these communication units within the environment, within other communications outside of the system, will be also influenced. and will be altered in some sense. So in this way, the system acts on the environment as well. So for example, consider a cat approaching a mouse. As the cat approaches a mouse, of course, the cat tries to avoid being noticed, but may bump into something, may move a branch, and so on. So it may interfere with the environment in ways that alerts the mouse in that. So how the system generates itself, the communications in it, that has an impact on the environment as well. And these are the system's actions. Now, on the other side, as we described, the environment modifies the behavior of communication units, and this alters how these communication units generate the communications within the system. Now, this change is how the system perceives its environment. So the change in the communications that are generated within the system has an impact of the communications participating in environmental communications as well. That's how the environment acts on the system, and the system perceives these changes, because the communications within the system change as well. So consider again the cat and the mouse, and there is the cat, and suddenly a mouse appears in the sight of the cat. Now, this change in the environment has an impact on the eye of the cat, on the retina, and on the neurons which sense the light and sends the signal into the brain, and there the cat realizes that, look, there is a mouse that could be hunted down. So let's move a bit further to see better how this works. So let's introduce the concept of the possibility. So in general, communications with the system follow many other communications. They can be seen as a sequence of communications. And every communication can be followed by many other possible communications, but not necessarily by any communication. There is a range of possible communications that may follow. Now, these possible communications that may follow constitute the possibility space of continuation for communication. So think about again the cat. Cat sees the mouse and tries to hunt the mouse, approaches the mouse. But it may approach in many ways. And depending on how it approaches, on that depends what next steps of approach are possible. Is it jumping? Is it slowly moving? Is it running? And so on. So there are many ways of picking the next communication behaviors. In the case of the cat, these communications are communications between the cells, which move the body of the mouse as they move the muscles move the body of the cat as they move closer to the mouse. And also, you may consider talking to a friend. So you say sentences, and these follow one after another. And in general, a sentence is followed by a range of sentences that can follow, but not any random sentence. So what you say determines what may follow after it, and that is the possibility space of continuation for your communications. So in a sense, every communication in these systems can be seen as determining what are the possible communications. And these possibilities that may follow, these are the things that define what's the system, what can belong to the system. So then in normal human speech, for example, there are quite clear rules about which sentences may follow previous sentences, how you compose your speech in order to make sense. And if you don't follow these rules, then the speech doesn't make sense. So it's outside of the system of communication that normally would be generated. Now, take this, the continuation, but turn it in reverse. The communications which are possible continuations for communication, those also reference backward the communications which which determine their possibility. So any communication that is generated in the system is referencing previous communications or possibly simultaneous communications as well. These communications are the ones which determine the possibility of this new communication that is generated in the system. So, turning around the concept of the possibility of communications, the referencing shows you which are the communications from the current system and from the past of the systems which are referenced by current communication. These are the ones which determine the possibility of these current communications. Now, again, to give you an example, think about talking to a friend about a friend, or to talk about your friend to somebody who you just met. Now, if you talk to a friend, it's relatively easy to reference past events or past previous stories that you both know, and you can build on those your communications. So you reference all these past in relatively simple ways. Now, if you talk to somebody who you just met about your friend, you will need to explicitly say quite a lot of things about your friend in order to build on these information and references to tell further stories about your friend. So what's important here is that the referencing works, but in one case you can easily reference because the references are already there in the past. In another case, you cannot talk so easily about your friend because the other person just doesn't know these references. So the possibility space is much wider, there is much less constraint on it. So this kind of highlights what we mean by reference and the possibility of possible continuation communications. So, in general, what we see here is that the systems are built by communications and they generate new communications which reference previous communications within the system and for which the possibility is determined by previous communications within the system. So you can look at this possibility space in a probabilistic way. You may say that over the range of communications, you have a probability distribution, which tells you how likely, how possible it is that one of these communications will be the next communications. Now, having these probability distributions over the space of possible communications effectively describes the system. So, let's just see an example. The human eye is extremely sensitive. Now, let's consider 3 possible continuations. Researchers hoping one day to build robots that can see as well as humans are now trying to copy what is known about the retina onto silicon chips. Or alternative B, let's consider the camera for a moment. Or alternative C, they are usually the ones who govern nations. Now, how likely are these continuations, given the first sentence, the human eye is extremely sensitive? Now, clearly, the likelihood depends on the context. However, let's assume that we are in a current context where we talk normally in everyday terms about these things. Now, the option C is probably not very likely. Linking the human eye sensitivity to those who govern nations, it's kind of unrelated. So although these may follow in a text, the likelihood is quite little. Alternative B, let's consider camera for a moment. Well, it is a possible continuation because it might be that the text that we are taking out is coming from discussion about cameras, where the human eye is taken as an example. So there is some possibility, some probability that option B might be the continuation for the first sentence. And option A, this is clear about building something based on the retina, something based on the human eye in the context of robotics. So actually that looks quite likely as a possible continuation for the first sentence. So in effect, what you can see in this everyday speech, option A is a considerably likely continuation, option B is somewhat likely continuation, and option C is a very, very unlikely continuation. So as you see, there is a distribution of probabilities over these three possible options of continuations, and that's how you can see this kind of probability distribution over the continuation of the speech. Now, for example, if you consider the recent human language generators, GPT-3 and others, these generative transformers. Essentially, these are the rules that these generative transformers mine out. What are the likelihoods of one sentence being continued by another? What are the likelihoods of certain words or sets of words being followed by other sets of words? And if you have sufficient data on these continuation probabilities, then you can generate, as these transformers show, quite human-like automatically generated speech. So here what you see on the screen is a representation of this discussion. So you have on the left side the current communication represented by an oval with a color. On the right side you have the possible continuations. So you have a current communication, the red oval, and then you have a distribution over possible communications, possible continuations. And you pick one from this distribution. You don't have to pick the most likely. The important thing is that you pick one, and if you consider many picks over time, this probability distribution is reproduced. So let's say you pick the white oval. Then again, you have a continuation distribution over the possible communications. Again, it's not necessary to pick the most likely, you just have to pick one that is likely. So in this case, again, the white is picked, which is actually relatively unlikely, less likely than any of the others, but it is a possible continuation. The likelihood is more than 0. Then you pick the next one, and in this case, you pick the light purple one, and so on. So as the system goes on, the communications are generated further. Now, you can see this kind of representation as a useful way of looking at system perceptions. So the environment induces the changes in the communications that affects the communications, and these will change the probability distributions of the new communications. So at every time when you pick a communication, that is a sample from this actual probability distribution over the possible continuations. There is an expectation of the system of what communications might follow given these referencing and continuation rules of the system, which determine how the communications are generated. And the difference between the expected and actual distribution represents the perception of the system. So you have an expected continuation distribution, and you have an actual continuation distribution. Represented by a sample. Now, clearly this is just a single sample, but you sample over time, and that will tell the system, in some abstract sense, what is the difference between the expectations and actuals. And this is the perception of the system. So let's see the representation of this. So again, you have on the left side the current, on the right side the possibles, and where the environment interferes, there we revise the probability, the likelihoods of these continuation communications. And if the likelihoods, these probabilities are revised, changed, and then we pick a sample from these possible continuations, that sample might be different. And in this case, it is. And that difference will be seen as the perception of the system about its environment. So, We discussed about these systems, and we said that these are essential communications. You have communication units which are outside of the system. We look at these as abstract communication units where we focus on their feature of generating and receiving communications. So this is a definition that we use for our systems. So why do these systems exist? And what we can say is that here the systems generate new communications according to their rules of referencing and continuation of communications, and they create many communications. So really the communication system is defined by the emergence of a dense interreferencing set of communications. When you have that, then you have a system. And if you don't have that, if there is no boundary between dense and rare communications, then there is no system. So the system generates itself by referencing previous communications of the system. And in this way, the system reproduces itself by having communications which follow its rules. And only those systems can be observed that reproduce it themselves and possibly expand themselves. Systems which don't do that, which have no communications, they cannot be observed. So in this context, what we see is that the systems exist to maintain and reproduce themselves. So this is really their main function, to exist as a system, as a set of dense communications which follow the system-specific rules and are surrounded by much rarer sets of communications around them. Now, if you look at the system from the perspective of an external observer, it may appear that the system has some particular function. However, if you look at it from inside of the system, its main function is really to maintain itself. Consider, for example, bureaucracies, large organizations. From outside perspective, a large organization may deal with pensions, or may deal with car license plates, and so on. There are many functions that from external observer might be associated with such systems. However, if you look at it from inside of the system, from inside of the system, the main purpose is to generate more communications within the system and maintain these communications, because otherwise the system disappears. And quite often, the purpose is also to increase, enlarge the system, generate even more of these communications. So, from inside perspective, the system really aims to maintain itself and grow itself. Whether from outside perspective, there might be some particular function associated with the system. So the system's main function is the self-reproduction of itself. Now, the systems may attract more communications, may attract communications from further communication units, and in this way the systems may expand as well. And those systems that expand, and perhaps expand faster than other systems that are around them, may dominate these other systems. So, for example, consider animals, the ones which can reproduce more and can adapt better to their environment, generally outcompete other animals which are less able to do so. Or look at human organization. You get chains of shops. The ones which organize themselves better, which adapt to their business environment better, grow faster and outcompete and dominate the others. Now, if we look at how the communication systems work, they generate their communications which reference other communications that are part of the systems and continue generating these communications to maintain and grow the system if possible. Now, these communications that the systems generate induce an action upon the environment because they modify the behavior of the communication units which participate in the system, And these alter behaviors of communications in the environment, so they have an impact on the environment. In the same way, the environment also interferes with the communications, and these are actions of the environment onto the system, which are perceptions or are perceived by the system. So consider, for example, a company which is selling, let's say, books. They interact with their customers. They advertise, they uh, organize events, and so on. These interactions with the customers, these are part of the system. They follow the rules of this bookshop, which might have an actual bookshop and may also have an online bookshop as well. How they interact with their customers, how they generate these systems communications, have an impact on their customers, which are other communication units from the system's perspective. And in some cases, manage to convince them to buy some of their books. And if they are really good, then they manage to buy more often their books than the books of their competitors. Think about the Amazon. The Amazon started as a specialist selling service for books. They were much better at reaching out to customers than other bookshops. And they grew. Today, they are a huge company selling anything and engage in many other activities. But they really started as a very highly efficient bookshop. In the same way, the environment acts on the system as well. If the bookshop is not able to sell easily the books, they need to change. They need to revise their procedures. They need to revise how they interact with their clients and hope that they can adapt to the environment better so that they can sustain and maintain themselves. So, in summary, in the second part of this lecture, we looked at the concept of the action. So these are the system's action on the environment where the system generates its communications, and through the participation of communications in these communications, they also impact on the other communications that they generate in the environment. And then they say the system acts on the environment. Then we discussed about the system perception. So these are the impacts of the environment onto the system. And what we said is that in a probabilistic sense, you can see perceptions as changed probability distributions over the possible continuations of the communications. And the system perceives this because the likelihoods of the communications are changing, and those impacts what communications can be generated within the system. So we introduced the concept of the possibility of possible communications. So these are the communications that can follow existing communications. And we said that for each possible communication, there is a probability of continuing the previous communication. And we also noted that there are many other potentially meaningful communications which may not be possible continuations, and these have zero probability of being a continuation. Then we introduce the concept of the reference, which turns this around and says that if you have a communication in the system, which is a continuation of previous communications, that this communication references all those communications which have an impact on determining its probability as a possible continuation communications following the previous communications. So in this way, each communication references a set of prior or possibly simultaneous communications within the system. And finally, we discussed the main function of the system, and we concluded that essentially the main function of the systems is to maintain themselves and reproduce and expand themselves as possible. So let's see a few questions. First, is it true that a seminar on human rights with participation of politicians is an action of the legal system on the political system? So here we have the political system that we said that it's about power, how the power is distributed, and many politicians participate in this. And we have a human rights seminar. So this is a discussion about human rights, part of the legal discussions. And clearly, if politicians participate at this seminar, their views on human rights might change. Their views on human rights might impact on how they vote or how they argue in the context of political discussions, let's say in the parliament. So in this way, indeed, the human rights seminar with participation of politicians can be seen as an action of the legal system on the political system. The political system is part of the environment of the legal system. In this way, the legal system acts on a part of its environment. Next question is it true that measuring the university choice of high school graduates is a perception of the university system about its social environment? And again, given the discussion that we had, this is right. So clearly, you have the university system, which is about providing higher education to many people, doing research and so on. However, this system depends very critically on the number of students who come to the university and on essentially the university system aims to provide a range of topics and subjects that the high school graduates would like to take on and take on for the purpose of study. So measuring the university choice of high school graduates is really, if you like, it's measuring the distribution of possible choices on subjects by these high school graduates. These can be seen as the communications of these graduates with the university, this choice of which subject they choose. So indeed, in that sense, this is a perception of the university system about their social environment. Next question is it true that when we talk to our GP, the general practitioner, doctor who provides our family doctor service, we should refer to recent political events in order to be understood? And, well, let's say in the UK or in the US, this is not necessary. Normally, you can talk to your doctor about your illness, or the problems, and that will be just fine. However, in a different political system, for example, in a communist dictatorship, referencing recent political events might be a requirement. So, in general, in our world today, here in the UK, this is not necessary. You don't need to talk about political events. But you just need to realize that there might be other worlds, other systems, other countries with other political systems where this might be an actual necessity. Next question is it true that we can tell a story about an old friend to a new friend without referencing explicitly anything that is already known by our new friend? And again, it's right. So when you talk to your new friend about your old friend, and you already talked to your new friend about the old friend in the past as well, so you pass down some knowledge, some stories. And you can build on this. You can build on the knowledge that you passed on already. So you can reference this in a kind of shortcut way. You don't need explicitly retelling every detail, but you just reference what you said before. And this is how referencing works in general as well. Finally, is it true that the main function of a politician is to represent their constituency? So here you have a politician who gets elected to the local council or to the parliament. And the question is it their main function to represent their constituency? Well, if you look at it from the politician's perspective, yes, he is a communication unit in the context, but he builds his own part of the political system through his communications with other politicians, other actors locally and nationally. And these communications constitute part of the political system and constitute the the political system around this particular politician. And from the perspective of this system, the main aim is to maintain the system. Now, representing the constituency quite easily be part of that, but not necessarily. So, if you like, perhaps you may say that it's a cynical view. From the perspective of the politician, the main function is to keep their elected seat. As long as they get re-elected, they continue to be part of the system and continue to build their own part of the political system. If they don't get elected, that no longer continues. So in that sense, their main function is to make sure that they get re-elected. If representing their constituencies fits into this main function, then it's very fine. If it doesn't, then they may not really represent fully their constituency, but they may just focus on getting re-elected. Thank you.